Take a look at the events you've written down. Is it real to you that the conclusion you reached, what makes me good enough or important is having people think well of me, is a valid interpretation of those events? Can you agree that virtually any child at that age and in those situations would have reached a similar conclusion? Now we're going to play the possibilities game. Well, imagine that 4 friends of yours are visiting you and looking at a videotape of the events you just wrote down. Your interpretation of those events when you were a child was, what makes me good enough or important is having people think well of me. That is one valid interpretation of Mom and Dad's behavior. That interpretation wasn't wrong, but there are other reasonable interpretations of the same childhood events that you didn't think of as a child. So let's ask each of your friends for another alternative interpretation. Can you see that one friend might well say, having people think well of you is certainly one way to become good enough or important, but it's definitely not the only way? Couldn't the events in your childhood be explained by this interpretation just as well as your interpretation, that what makes me good enough or important is having people think well of me? Here's what your second friend says. Having your parents, teachers, or coaches think well of you might make you good enough or important, but if a stranger or someone you didn't like thought well of you, probably wouldn't make any difference at all. Doesn't this interpretation also explain those events in your childhood just as well as your interpretation, that what makes me good enough or important is having people think well of me? Here's a third possible interpretation of your childhood events that one of your friends suggests. When people thought well of you, you felt good enough or important, but did that feeling last? If not, it only made you feel good enough or important for a little while, but it didn't really make you good enough or important. Doesn't this interpretation also explain those events in your childhood? Here's another interpretation from your fourth friend. As a kid, you thought you were not good enough and not important, but it was never really true. Is it real to you now that those beliefs never were true? Is it real that they were just meanings you assigned to meaningless events? So if you were good enough and important to begin with, what did you have to do to become good enough or important? Nothing. Couldn't any one of these interpretations explain your childhood interactions with your parents just as well as your original interpretation? What makes me good enough or important is having people think well of me? Of course they can. So is it real to you that a belief you've lived with almost your entire life, something you thought was a fact, is not a fact, isn't the truth at all? It's only a truth, merely one interpretation of many possible interpretations of earlier events, right? With a little help from me and your friends, you can see that not feeling good enough or important, then getting praise from your parents, teachers, or coaches, and finally feeling really good about yourself could have at least 4 different reasonable interpretations or meanings. Do you remember what you wrote down a few minutes ago as the source of your belief? What makes me good enough or important is having people think well of me? Take a look at the text box below on your screen. Right now, imagine seeing what you saw then and hearing what you heard then. Now take a few minutes and really imagine the events of your childhood that led you to form the belief, what makes me good enough or important is having people think well of me. Didn't it seem when you were a child as if you could actually see what makes me good enough or important is having people think well of me in those early events with your parents? It did, didn't it? You may have the sense that you didn't see the belief, you felt it. Once you formed the belief, what makes me good enough or important is having people think well of me, you probably did feel it. I'll get back to the feeling in a minute, but what I'd like you to focus on now is not the feeling, but on my question. When you were being praised, didn't it seem as if you saw what makes me good enough or important is having people think well of me? As if you could point to it? As if you could have said to me, can't you see, Morty, what makes me good enough or important is having people think well of me? Now that you think you saw what makes me good enough or important is having people think well of me, I'd like you to look again. Did you really see what makes me good enough or important is having people think well of me? See, if you did, what does what makes me good enough or important is having people think well of me look like? Can you really point to it? Does what make me good enough or important is having people think well of me have a color? A shape? Location? Is it real to you now that you saw events but never really did see what makes me good enough or important as having people think well of me? If anything you can really see can be described, and if you can't describe what makes me good enough or important as having people think well of me looks like, is it clear now that you never really saw it? And since you never really saw what makes me good enough or important as having people think well of me, what did you actually see? Is it clear now that all that really happened was that you frequently had a negative sense of yourself as a child? Then you did something that resulted in a positive response from your parents, teachers, or coaches, and at that point you felt really good about yourself? In other words, all you really saw was a series of events. What happened was that you looked at a series of events that can be interpreted in many different ways. You gave the events one meaning, which was what makes me good enough or important is having people think well of me. By giving that specific meaning to the events, each time you were praised for doing things a certain way, it was as if you could see that meaning in those events. But you didn't discover the meaning in the events, you gave the meaning to the events. They had no meaning before you created one. Is it real now that the events had no meaning until you gave one to them? Here's another way to understand that events have no inherent meaning. When I say that, I'm saying you don't know anything for sure about the kind of person you are as a result of these childhood experiences. What do I know for sure about what makes you a good human being just from knowing how you felt when people thought well of you as a child? Is it clear that I wouldn't know anything? And if I don't know anything, you don't either. All you know for sure is what actually happened. You got praise when you did things your parents, teachers, or coaches wanted, and then you felt good about yourself. And finally, if you never saw what makes me good enough or important as having people think well of me out there in the world, where has it been all these years? Did I hear you say that what makes me good enough or important as having people think well of me has only existed in your mind? That you never did see it out there in the world? That's right. Now, if the belief is more real to you as a feeling than as a concept, here's another way to look at it. Didn't it seem as if feeling really good about yourself after getting praise from important adults when you were a child made you feel what makes me good enough or important as having people think well of me? You just said yes, didn't you? But you just agreed that the events have no meaning. Is it possible for events that have no meaning to make you feel what makes me good enough or important as having people think well of me? Or anything else for that matter? Of course not. So if being praised by important adults in your childhood couldn't have made you feel what makes me good enough or important as having people think well of me, what did make you feel that? By now I think you know the answer to that question. Please answer out loud. That's right. You felt that only because that's the meaning you had already given to being praised. Let me help you make this real. Imagine that I had been there when you were a little child, and it helped you realize that there were alternative interpretations. And after that conversation you concluded, the praise made me feel good enough and important, but it didn't really make me good enough and important. Here's what I'd like you to do now. Really imagine this happening when you were a child. Now imagine that after our conversation, you feel good after getting a positive response from your parents, teachers, or coaches. Notice how it feels to be a child who's thinking, having people think well of me makes me feel as if I'm good enough or important, but it never really makes me good enough or important. You can use the pause button below to pause the video while you make these childhood scenarios more real for yourself. When you're done imagining, press the play button. As you imagine this scene, does it still feel like your parents' words and actions and your response are making you feel what makes me good enough or important is having people think well of me? Probably not. And if you didn't feel what makes me good enough or important is having people think well of me then, would you feel it now? Again, the answer is no. So the comments from important people in your life when you were a child never caused you to feel what makes me good enough or important is having people think well of me. That feeling came from your interpretation of their comments and behavior. And because your feelings were not caused by events in reality, they were only the result of a meaning you made up to explain the events, is it real that the good feelings you had about yourself when your parents praised you for doing things perfectly didn't tell you anything at all about what makes you good enough or important? They didn't, did they? Okay, now take a deep breath, let it out slowly, and then say out loud, what makes me good enough or important is having people think well of me. Is it the truth? Does it still feel like the truth? Your answer is very important here. Don't forget that we form beliefs to give meaning to events that have no real meaning. Having done that, we then think we observe the meaning in the events out there in the world. It becomes a fact for us. Once we realize that the earlier events never had any real meaning, that the meaning was only in our mind, that it was never a fact, that the feeling we had was caused by the meaning we gave meaningless events, the belief disappears forever. Take another deep breath and say, what makes me good enough or important is having people think well of me, out loud. I bet it feels very different when you say these words now than when you said them at the beginning of this exercise. Do these words feel true even a little bit? Unless the belief is 100% gone and the words don't feel true at all, you probably still have the belief. Remember, holding a belief is like being pregnant. You either is or you ain't. There's no sort of. If the belief is still there, it probably still seems like you saw it. Once it no longer seems as if you saw what makes me good enough or important is having people think well of me in those early events, the belief will be gone. So please click the repeat button to repeat that step of the process. When beliefs are eliminated using the Lefko method, they rarely return. In rare cases, the belief comes back, but with much less intensity. If that happens to you, just redo the process for any belief that returns. You can always repeat any of the beliefs as many times as you wish. Now that you're clear the belief really is gone, let me congratulate you for eliminating another belief. Many people, possibly even you, spend years trying to totally get rid of beliefs, and you just did it in less than 30 minutes. Now, you're probably very busy, like the rest of us, so it might be difficult to find the time to keep coming back to this program. If you need motivation, notice the changes that already have occurred. The little voice that criticizes what you do has probably become a bit quieter. Your self-doubt probably has decreased somewhat. And after this belief, you probably will be a little less concerned about what others think of you. By the time you eliminate the last belief and decondition the last conditionings, the symptoms will have disappeared totally. Before you move on to the next belief, you might want to revisit the process, who am I really? It shifts your identity from the creation to the creator, from the piece of sculpture to the sculptor. When that happens, you feel that you're the creator of your life. You experience on a very profound level that anything's possible and that you have no limitations. Many clients have told me that this is their favorite part of the entire Lefko method. Now you can either click Who Am I Really?, click Next Belief to get rid of another belief, or close this program. Then make a note to yourself when you plan to return and resume the program.